Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mex Move, the podcast on Mexican business and finance. I'm Damien Fraser.
And I'm Eduardo Garcia.
And today we're going to talk about four subjects. First, we're going to talk a little bit about remittances and the threat from Trump. Secondly, we're going to talk about Aeromexico and its upcoming IPO. Third, we're going to talk about tariffs and what Mexican companies and multinationals would be affected in the event that the Trump administration puts 25% tariffs on Mexican exports to the US. And finally, we're going to talk about data centers.
That's right. Why don't you start, Damien, with those remittances that are hugely important now for the Mexican economy?
Sure. So on remittances, first a few key facts. We don't have full numbers yet, but in 2024, remittances likely came to about $66 billion. It's about 3.5% of Mexican GDP. Obviously much bigger in states where there are a lot of migrants in the US, like Michoacan. The growth has been pretty spectacular. It's basically since 2018, remittances were around about $35 billion. It's more than doubled in the 6 years since then. Grown because Mexicans in the US grown in number. Mexicans in the US are making more money, and because the economic necessities in Mexico for those remittances have continued to be very significant.
Although the pace has decelerated a little bit over the past few years, record numbers every year, but not as fastly growing as they were before, if I'm right.
Yeah, in pesos for sure, because the peso was obviously very stable or even strong against the dollar from 2021 to mid of 2024. So when they translated into pesos, we actually saw some declines in remittances. Dollars, they maintained a pretty steady paced high single-digit growth, and that's why you saw the doubling. We also saw a significant increase in November when Trump won, and we saw the same thing back in 2016, actually. There was a huge increase then, even bigger than last year. Back then, it was about 25% increase. It was
on fears of him doing something to those remittances, right?
Yeah, exactly. This time, there was a spike, not as significant. What are the fears right now? J.D. Vance, when he was the senator from Ohio, did put legislation forward. It didn't go anywhere, fortunately, that would tax those remittances from the United States to Mexico, but allow that tax to be used as a credit for people's tax bills. And so effectively, if you were paying US tax, you'd be able to collect that commission or that tax back. But if you won, that would be money lost. And obviously, to the extent that undocumented migrants in the US are not in the formal economy and not paying tax, that would be a gross tax that they wouldn't be able to recover. Trump himself, back in 2016, also talked about taxes on remittances. That didn't happen. And the concern then and now is if you do something like that, then you will encourage kind of black market in remittances that will avoid that tax. What might the black market be? It might be, literally suitcases of cash being sent back to Mexico, which would then be much harder to control. It might be people using cryptocurrencies. It's now relatively straightforward to sign up to crypto exchanges and send stable coins back to the US and other fintech kind of solutions that bypass. If there's only a tax to Mexico, then you send the money to Guatemala or you send the money to Puerto Rico where there isn't such a tax, and then it gets bypassed. I don't know if you remember years ago that when Mexico charged a lot more for phone calls from Mexico to the US, this industry developed of callbacks where you would call the US and then automatically they would call you back.
Correct.
So the concern would be, and I think the expectation is that this won't happen because people will find a way, given how easy it is to move money around the world, to bypass this tax, and then it would have a negative consequences in terms of controlling flows of money and trafficking, money laundering, and so on.
Do you think this proposal has more chances now than it did back then, Damien?
Well, clearly it didn't happen back then. So compared to back then, evidently, as we don't know what's going to happen now, the chances are higher and Trump clearly seems to be emboldened by his electoral mandate. He clearly has control of the Senate, of the House. So it's more likely then than now. At the same time, we are seeing interesting changes in the remittance market. The remittance market has traditionally been dominated by Electra and Coppel here in Mexico, working with the exchange houses like Western Union in the US. And it's been relatively expensive, reflecting the large amount of transaction costs involved in sending your money from the US to Mexico through a Western Union that then uses a correspondent bank that then sends the money to Banco Azteca, and then the person picks up their cash or gets the money in their bank app in Mexico. So you've seen Bitso, which is, as you know, the crypto
Exchange.
exchange, very aggressively go into the money transfer business, not directly to the end consumer, to the end migrant, but working with the electors or with other fintechs in providing a stable coin, typically USDC, through blockchain technology, allowing that money to be sent back to Mexico, but avoiding to a large extent the banking system using blockchain technology. It's much cheaper, much quicker. You get the money instantly, and it's 24/7. Right now, if someone sends money at midnight to an Electra store, Electra or Banco Azteca, take the exchange risk because the banking system is closed. But doing it through a stable coin means that you can lock in, from the point of view of Electra, you can lock in the FX rate between pesos and dollars that very moment. So for the end companies in Mexico, it's also very advantageous. And Bitso Business has said publicly that they're now responsible for about 10% of the total remittances from the US to Mexico, which is almost $7 billion.
In a very short period of time, they've gotten this.
Yeah, and it's probably, we don't know because it's a private company, but probably Bitso Business is, if they're charging 10 basis points, they're making in revenue 7 million a year almost from that business. So it's becoming a significant business.
Would that also help the migrant avoid the taxes if it happens through blockchain and this stable coin?
I mean, if there is a tax, which we obviously don't know right now, I would imagine if it's been done through Western Union or through Banco Azteca, then no, because those are regulated entities. But it may well be the case that either Bitso or someone else can use blockchain technology with an unregulated entity to avoid that. There's a very good app that I actually use. I don't know if you've used it, called Felix Pago.
No,
Felix Pago works brilliantly, and it's a lot cheaper than most other remittance services company. It works through WhatsApp. You basically register your phone number, your bank account in the US, and your bank account in Mexico, if you have bank accounts in both places, and you send a WhatsApp to Felix Pago transferring money from your US bank account to your Mexican bank account, or
huh.
vice versa. They work with Bitso Business. They only charge you a flat fee, about $3, and you get your money right away, basically 24/7. So
Only US, Mexico, or does it cover other countries?
Felix Pago I think, is based in Miami. They did a Series A fundraise in May of last year for about $15 million, and they're working in about 7 countries. But Mexico is by far, as I understand it,
By far.
by far the biggest. So Mexico, as I mentioned, is approaching $70 billion of remittances. That's probably half the total remittance market in Latin America.
Probably one of the largest per capita, no, in the world, or the largest in the world, no? Maybe.
Not per capita, because from a relative point of view, Salvador, Nicaragua, you see
Correct.
remittances get to 20-25% of GDP, and those economies are heavily dependent on remittances. But because Mexico is a much bigger
Larger.
country in terms of absolute dollars, it's a lot more relevant.
And just finally, for this year, remittances are expected to continue growing. Depends on Trump, depends on many things. So, what's your view if the US economy does well?
Yeah, it's going to depend on if there is a tax or isn't. And it may then become much more difficult to trace. Remittances may remain quite strong, but we may not be seeing them
Hmm,
in the numbers that the
officially.
authorities publish if they're going underground. And then it will depend if Trump is successful in following through on deporting millions of undocumented migrants, because that is also presumably going to affect the remittances. If there are less Mexicans in the US, it's going to be less money being
Central.
sent. And then, to the extent that people will change their behavior to avoid being deported, they may avoid going to places like Western Union, where they may see immigration authorities or police and so on in the US looking to deport migrants. So
Maybe they'll be
that,
waiting for them.
that said, remittances grew a lot in the first Trump presidency. People have been kind of predicting that as Mexicans in the US, people with Mexican heritage in the US, become more integrated, remittances would fall. And that hasn't occurred. So despite the integration, second, third generation Mexicans, we continue to see this number growing faster than GDP in both countries and representing a bigger share. But I think it's fair to say that the uncertainty right now, along with a lot of other things related to what Trump's going to do, is bigger. Coppel and Electra have a big advantage, which is why they have the lion's share of remittances, because they have banks, regulated banks, which allows them to have much more cash. So Electra allows you to take out 50,000 pesos in cash from a remittance, which is 10 times what an OXXO does. But OXXO has announced, did say in one of its recent earnings calls, that it's investing in new sort of technology to handle larger amounts of cash. And OXXO just reached a deal with Nubank. You may well see, irrespective of what happens in the US, a bit more competition. And then Revolut, the UK bank, has just got its license, as you recall, in Mexico. And one of the areas that Revolut has been very successful in is in cross-border transfers or remittances. So they presumably, once they're up and running, they've got their license, but they still aren't up and running in Mexico. They're going to also start to tackle the remittance market, and they are fully functional in the US. So they will be both in the US. My guess is Revolut will be maybe more focused on the business market and less on the Mexican migrants, but maybe they'll go for both. But we are seeing more competition, and we are seeing, as I mentioned, blockchain technology. And an example, Stripe, the online payments company, just paid over $1 billion for a relatively small blockchain company called Bridge. And Bridge focuses exactly on that, using blockchain to facilitate cross-border transfers in a more efficient way. So if Bridge is worth $1 billion, then Bitso business is definitely worth, something not too far away from that. So it may well be that, Bitso, its crypto exchange and its remittance business, turns out to be the most successful so far in fintech in Mexico.
Correct. Shall we move on?
Absolutely.
Well, I want to talk to you, Damien, about Aeromexico and the recent announcement that it might come back to the market with a secondary IPO to unload, I guess, some of the companies that acquire the company or not, didn't acquire necessarily, but obviously change some of the debt to capital when the COVID hit Aeromexico especially hard in 2020 and had to declare, well, it's concurso mercantil in Spanish. Not that it was declared bankruptcy, but he had to go through bankruptcy procedures to stabilize its situation. And after they've recovered from those tough years, they're now thinking of coming back to the Mexican market and to the US market. They might do a dual IPO to list their shares again in Mexico as they were listed before. The only other Mexican airline company listed on the exchange is Volaris, a low-cost airline, and this will bring back Aeromexico to the market. The main shareholders today of Aeromexico are Apollo Management, Delta Airlines, and a group of Mexican investors, as well as some private equity funds like Silver Point Capital, Oak Tree Capital Management. And they are all, I think, considering the possibility of unloading some of the shares if the IPO happens to materialize in the coming months.
Yeah, it's interesting, Eduardo, because I remember when Apollo did the debtor financing, the DIP financing back in the summer of 2020, an absolute ground zero of COVID from an airline travel perspective. Most of the Aeromexico planes were grounded. Aeromexico had almost no cash flow, had significant expenses. And at the time, a lot of people thought that Apollo was crazy giving $1 billion to Aeromexico, especially as Aeromexico had already gone through a similar type of Chapter 11 proceedings in the past. It wasn't as if it had been a great business. It had been severely affected by the growth of Volaris and Viva, and of course, Mexicana itself, the other full-service airline in Mexico, had gone bust. And it's turned out to be one of the greatest investments of all time. It was brilliant because what Apollo did was, apart from give the money to allow Aeromexico to continue to function, is that they were able to renegotiate a lot of the lease terms that Aeromexico had on its airplanes, and also make the labor contracts a lot more flexible with the pilots and the stewards and so on. And the combination of that took out about $450 million of costs from Aeromexico. At the same time, they got lucky because Volaris had a substantially cut capacity, especially last year, as there was a big engine recall
That's correct.
on its Airbus planes. And so last year you saw capacity at Volaris, which is the biggest airline in terms of passengers in Mexico, down by 12% or so, whereas you saw increases at Aeromexico, especially on the international side. So this overall reduction in capacity meant that Aeromexico was able to hike its fees significantly while still benefiting from this lower cost structure. So Aeromexico last year, made hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of free cash flow, and they were able to pay back some of that initial investment through a dividend or a capital decrease. They took out a bond last year, first to pay back the existing bond that they had, but also to finance a huge dividend. So they've already made a good part of their money back, and then they're going to make, on top of that, another return when and if the IPO happens. So it's been an absolute star. People complain a lot about how difficult it is to invest in Mexico, but if you have the guts, the intelligence, and then the stars are aligned, you can do well, as Apollo showed.
And Aeromexico has also done well in terms of technology investments from what I've reviewed. Not only have they renovated their fleet, they've also improved their mobile application. I use it a lot. It's quite friendly user. They have also implemented an advanced AI powered weather system developed by IBM to participate and manage on weather impacts on flight operations. This year, just a few weeks ago, it was considered the most punctual airline in the world, which I always find a little bit strange because when you leave, sometimes you leave with a delay, but they've given themselves some time. So you land on time because the flight scheduling hours was longer than it was meant to be. But anyway, they did get that prize, and I will be interesting to see whether the reaction in the market, if they actually come through, will be strong enough for them to continue with this IPO proposition that they floated recently. They've already mentioned some of the potential underwriters. They might be Barclays, Morgan Stanley, Morgan Securities, Evercore, and Apple Global Securities. So I think the writing is on the wall for this to actually take place, which will be good again for the market as we haven't had a real IPO in quite a long time.
Yeah, I think the prospects look quite bright. Aeromexico, I think, is the largest kind of incumbent airline in the world that doesn't have any competition from another full-service airline. So there are only 3 airlines now of any meaningful size: Aeromexico, Volaris, and Viva, and the other 2 are obviously low-cost airlines. So they're in a very comfortable position. And the government took out capacity from Mexico City Airport, reduced the number of slots. That gave Aeromexico an even larger share of the slots that remain, and also helped the punctuality because obviously if there's fewer planes taking off and landing, then it's a bit easier to be more punctual. Viva's doing well. In fact, I don't have all the numbers, but because Volaris was more affected by the Whitney engine recall, and we may actually see Viva overtake Volaris in passengers this year, which is astonishing given that Viva was half the size of Volaris. So Viva's been very well managed. They've picked their routes quite successfully, and they've been able to be less affected, and maybe by luck or maybe by skill, by the Pratt and Whitney recall. They had some issues because they also fly the Airbus 320 variants of that, but they're very close now to Volaris in total number of passengers.
Obviously, we have the other airline that shows that it's not an easy business as everyone thinks it might be, like Mexicana, the state-owned airline that came back into the market last year. It's having troubles by reducing routes, cutting flights. So then again, you can see that managing an airline is not as easy as one can see. And Viva have shown that it can be done, but that you need the knowledge to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on, Eduardo, to the next subject. On Saturday, Trump has said that he will, or that he plans to impose 25% tariffs on Mexican exports to the US and Canadian exports. And this week, the Journal, the spokeswoman of Trump, have both said that that plan continues. As we all know, may well be modified. We don't know if it happens, whether it will be on every sector, or every goods, whether it's just going to be an announcement, or with a future date that the tariffs will be imposed, or whether the tariffs will be imposed, immediately. But it has affected the Mexican stock market, and not every stock in the same way. And clearly, the auto industry is the one that's most exposed. Mexico supplies about 50% of U.S. imports come from Mexico. GM produces about 900,000 cars in Mexico, like the Chevrolet Silverado, the GMC Sierra, the Equinox. So there's a lot of concern. You have local companies like Numac and Auto Parts that would be affected by this, because basically since NAFTA and then since USMCA, you've seen a full integration of the supply chains in the car industry. So GM had its fourth quarter conference call, and the CEO said that they were putting in place potential plans in the event that this is confirmed, and effectively they will use, well, this is the implication from the call, they'll use their Mexican production, some of it at least, to export to Europe or to Asia, mainly to Europe, and then try and rev up production in the US. I guess exactly what Trump wants, to try and mitigate the effect of this.
This morning, I guess this podcast will be released a few days from today, but our president was confident, and she said it, that the tariffs will not be implemented by Saturday. If it does, It's gonna be tremendously chaotic, I assume, because I've reviewed how some of these car parts are produced, and they do cross the border. An engine might cross the border 2 or 3 times before it's assembled in a Mexican factory. So if it comes from the States to Mexico and Mexico puts retaliatory tariffs and then moves back to the state, moves back to Mexico, goes to Canada, that piece is going to be tremendously costly. And the competitive advantage of North American car makers will be devastated if these tariffs come to fruition. So I don't know if anyone has explained to Trump the repercussions this might have on his own auto industry and his own US companies. It could be quite serious, I suspect, if it actually takes place.
Yeah, it would be an own goal. It would help, especially if tariffs are just applying to Mexico and Canada, which are your two most important trading partners. You'd be helping the Japanese car exports to the US, European car exports, and hurting your own car companies, which are more integrated with Mexico, GMs and the Fords.
Correct.
So it'd be kind of self-defeating to do it, which makes most people, including this morning President Sheinbaum, think that it won't happen, that this is a threat. I guess Trump's end goal is to try and renegotiate USMCA, TMEC as it's called here, so that there's a higher US component in the
Cars.
value added. So in the USMCA, I think 40% of the cars have a $16 per hour, which is basically US and Canada component to be eligible for tariff exemption. So maybe the goal will be to increase that percentage that comes from high wage countries and reduce incentives to invest in Mexico.
Correct, as well as probably also the other element that is quite crucial is the auto parts that come from Chinese companies. That's a tricky one because if the Chinese companies constructs plant in the US to an engine part, how would Trump view that? Is that manufacturing that is not welcome to America, or is it manufacturing that is welcome? Because that component will be then be American, will be North American. So there's still a lot of questions about how this is going to play out for the entire auto industry in both Mexico, the US, and let's not forget Canada, which also provides steel components to a lot of auto plants in America.
And it's not just cars, although that's a big sector. There would be impact on certain consumer goods that are made in Mexico. I guess the most famous would be tequila, which has to come from Mexico. And Cuervo is a listed company in Mexico. And you can see from its stock price that people are nervous. What would happen if tariffs were imposed? Fortunately for Cuervo, there's no direct substitute in the US except for other spirits, which are not the same, but nevertheless, the cost would go up to the end consumer. And then you have building and construction materials. About a quarter of US cement and construction materials are imported, some from Mexico. And then there would be a knock-on effect in Mexico, not just the direct exporters, but there's less employment that would affect consumer. If exporting companies see their cash flows affected, then banks that lend money to exporting companies might also see some worries. And the Mexican stock market, from the highs back in March of last year, in dollar terms, is down about 35%, driven by concerns on the constitutional changes that first AMLO and then President Sheinbaum put through, such as removing in the eyes of many at least, removing the independence of the judiciary and getting rid of the independent regulatory agencies, and then Trump's victory, and then Trump's threats, what he will do as president. All of that has contributed to create quite a negative environment, and bank stocks like Banorte are now trading under 7 times earnings from being at 10 times earnings, back in March. But a lot of people, made a lot of money in Mexico by being contrarian and buying stocks when they're beaten down. 2016 is a good example. If you'd bought then, you'd have done very well. Trump turned out to be much less of a threat than people feared at the time.
One last thing that I want to mention, Damien, is that if you read the America First Trade Policy Memorandum that President Trump signed on his inaugural day, he mentions there that the deadline for all the studies to be handed to him on the trade policy that America should follow, on how USMCA affects workers, companies, whatever, it's April the 1st. He then later on self imposed this February 1st deadline for allegedly putting on tariffs on Mexico and Canada. So I guess he could still say on Saturday, well, we haven't decided. We're still looking at the studies that I asked all these ministries to look into it. So the threat might still be there, and it would be a negotiating ploy, like you say, I think, for the long term goal that might be to review or renegotiate the USMCA in more favorable terms for the US.
Well, let's hope it doesn't happen for Mexico's sake and for the US's sake.
I guess so, yeah, for the whole region. We've been married for 30 years. It's hard to carry on with a divorce. It's very expensive. But let's talk about data centers and Amazon's announcement. The announcement actually didn't take place a week ago. The first announcement took place in February of 2024. People don't realize this, but this is something that was obviously broadcast on the Mañanera of President Sheinbaum because it's a large investment. It's a $5 billion investment over 15 years by Amazon Web Services to develop a huge data center with three separate components that could be redundant. If one fails, the other one comes in Querétaro, one of the cities that has probably grown the fastest in Mexico over the past 10 or 20 years. And what the investment does show is that Mexico, despite all these fears and changes, it's still a place or a market that has attracted large sums of money from different type of companies and industries. And the fact that Amazon Web Service chose Querétaro also indicates that that part of Mexico has reliable engineers, has reliable resources that allows Amazon to pick it up as a center of great computing web services value for those companies that are moving into the technology area or digitalizing their operations. That's what Amazon is hoping to achieve by creating these data centers in Mexico. It's still a big announcement, despite that it was done not now, but a few months ago. But there are still some challenges that we'll have to see how they overcome them. First, the water issue. As you know, data centers do consume a lot of water. It seems that the new technology that Amazon Web Services is going to use for these data centers is less water intensive. They can cool their routers or all the machinery that will have in the data centers with fewer consumption of water. Then there is also the electricity capacity of Mexico, whether the CFE or others will be able to provide these data centers with the power that they need. But I assume that if Amazon has made this announcement, it's because they've already looked into this supply of energy that they need. How are they going to do it? It's not clear whether it's going to be a private entity developing the energy for the data centers or whether it will be the CFE. It's not yet clear. The other repercussion that I want to highlight is that it plans to use these data centers to train a lot of Mexicans in digital technology. They talk about hundreds of thousands of engineers that they will be training on their computing cloud services in Querétaro. So I think the repercussions of this will be significant for the benefit of the Mexico in the future.
Yeah, if it happens, it's obviously great news. If it happens to that extent, the 5 billion mentioned, I think, as you say, a big constraint is energy. CFE doesn't have enough energy right now to take that kind of investment in a data center. You could argue that private investment will take care of it, but the government is committed to being 54% of electricity generation, so which is roughly where it is today. So for every dollar that the private sector puts in, CFE has to put in a little bit more than a dollar. That's a big constraint. Then the plants need to be efficient. They need gas. Mexico itself doesn't produce nearly enough gas, so that has to come from the US, where there's plenty of gas, but you need pipelines. There are significant pipeline investments going on. They need to be connected. And then you need transmission, which is a weak link in CFE that also requires a lot of money, and that's a CFE monopoly. So I think, without having all the details, Amazon is saying you provide the electricity and the transmission, the gas, and here's your billions of dollars. But the government now has to do its part, and it's made its life a little bit harder by putting in these slightly unnecessary but nationalistic constraints.
And there is a new elephant in the room, Damien, that is called the impact of deep seek in terms of this technology advancements that it has proven, not in terms of traditional infrastructure, but in terms of AI. As we saw this week, what DeepSeek brought to the markets was unprecedented, I would say, in terms of showing that AI models could be trained with less energy, less technological prowess, and less of other things that cause the markets to tumble the way we saw them. I wonder if the same does not apply to data centers and computing services on the cloud, as they might not need as much energy as they thought they would. I don't know. There might be some repercussions also on all these projects that are being generated in the future.
Yeah, for sure. We saw on Monday that a lot of the data center companies and energy companies
Suffering.
also suffer because of this, although they've recovered a bit. And it seems that DeepSeek itself has been training on OpenAI and Anthropic and other AI companies. So the investment has to be made, and they're piggybacking off it.
Yeah.
We'll see. But it's exciting that they're investing in it. There are local players, Keo Networks, which was sold by a local Mexican billionaire, to I Squared Capital, a private equity fund. It's also investing 400 million or so in new data centers, also in Querétaro. So there's a lot of opportunities there. Mexico's producing a lot of engineers, but it does need to get its energy sorted out, which hopefully will happen. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you, Damien.
Look forward to everyone joining Next Moves next Friday. Thank you.
Take care.